Hi, this week we're going to be looking at primates, but before we get into looking at primates, I want to briefly talk about classification, or taxonomy. And this is basically how we arrange and organize all species. So taxonomy itself is taken from the word taxus, which means arrangement, and nomia, meaning method. And we've talked about taxonomy and arrangement before. We talked about the father of taxonomy at the very beginning of class with Carl Linnaeus, or Carolus Linnaeus. Now, before Linnaeus came around, there was a method, a way of organizing species, but the method was a little complex and names were a little bit long, such as this multi-syllable, multi-worded name used to describe a tomato plant. So Carl Linnaeus came down, simplified a little bit, where this got condensed to this. And it gets a little bit more complicated than that. He didn't just come up with genus and species that we've discussed before. He came up with what we call the phylogenetic tree, or the tree of life. And what this does is it looks at different features organisms share in common, different similarities, differences they have and similarities they have, and organizes them based on these similarities. And the lens starts out very broad. It starts out with domain, and this lens and looking at similar features gets more and more specific as it goes down this tree till we finally hit species. So let's go ahead and look at us, where we fall under this. Let's start with domain. In domain, there's basically three different types of domain. There's bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And where we fall underneath is eukarya right here. Multicelled organisms or organisms that have a nucleus inside their cell, a nuclear membrane that contains their DNA. And this is where we fall underneath. Now, if we were to look at eukarya and get a little bit more specific, look at kingdoms under eukarya. We have protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. And we, humans, fall right here, underneath animalia. So let's go ahead and get even more specific. Now, before I move on, let me really quickly let you know. So Linnaeus came up with the phylogenetic tree, where there were kingdom, domain, quickly go back, kingdom, domain, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. What we have done since the time of Linnaeus, we've actually inserted other little tiny subclassifications because of the need to be able to define things a little bit better. So, where we fall underneath these classifications and subclassifications is as follows. We're under the kingdom Animalia, under the phylum Chordata, which means that we have a spinal cord, and we are a unique subset of creatures that have spinal cords where we have a vertebrae that protects our spinal cord. So we fall in the subphylum Vertebrata, the class Mammalia, the order of primates, the suborder of haplorhines, the hyperorder of Anthropoidea, the infraorder of Catarrhines, superfamily of Hominidea, family of Hominidae, subfamily of Homininae, and finally genus Homo and species Sapien. Now, out of all these come test time, I'm going to hold you responsible for only the ones that you see in bold. Now, before we move on, let's talk about some definitions. So we look at similarities in features, similar common morphologies that organisms have. And these common morphologies can fall under two different classifications. One can be called homologous traits, where you have similar looking features in an organism because of a shared ancestry. That means these organisms are not too far away on their deviation from the family tree where they speciated. Here we see an example of an arm bone. This is called your radius bone. And a radius bone in a human, a cat, a whale, and even a bat have similar morphological features in them. They have similar what we call proximal ends as well as distal ends. And the reason for this is at one time humans, cats, whales, and bats, all being mammals, share a common ancestor. Now, although all species do theoretically share a common ancestor, we look at similarities of traits in another way. We call these analogous traits, where features in an organism look the same and serve the same function, but are not from a common ancestor. Instead, they serve the same function because of similar adaptive pressures were applied to both organisms. This is called convergent evolution. And here we see an example of analogous traits with an insect wing, for example, versus a bird wing. Both help with flight, both have similar shapes, but they do not come from a common ancestor. They come from similar adaptive pressures, this idea of convergent evolution. All right, now let's look at classification, specifically two different ways we classify organisms. One is called gradistic classification, the other is called cladistic classification. Now this differs slightly with your reading, where they call gradistic classification and genetic classification. And there's a good reason for this. In gradistic classification, we look at shared ancestral traits. These are traits that are common because of a shared ancestry. When we look at cladistic classification, we look at shared derived traits. These are traits that have a common, that are similar because of evolution, because of evolutionary forces. Now, the reason your book names it differently is because it's easier to look at these two traits as just features here, and then looking at genetics or DNA as far as cladistic. So one more time, to summarize, gradistic classification looks at just the anatomy, looking at features, where cladistic classification will look at genetics as well. Let's look at an example of how classifying organisms may change whether or not we look at gradistic or cladistic. So looking at gradistic, for instance, in our closest living relatives, we look at orangutans, gorillas, and chimps. We put them into one group, where humans, we fall over here all by ourselves. So this is gradistic classification, where they look like they share more common features than they do with us. Now, looking at DNA, we find that we're actually a lot more similar to to gorillas and chimps than we are to any other organism. So we go ahead and place ourselves, gorillas, chimps, and humans, under one classification, orangutans on another. So one more time, here we have gradistic, not using DNA, just looking at features. But when we look at the commonality in our DNA, we see that we are very much related. I want to finish up by talking about two other methods of classification, and this is K-selectivity versus R-selectivity. And the basics behind this is that K-selective species take a longer time to reproduce. They really invest in their young, usually have longer lifespans, larger body sizes, and fewer offspring. Whereas R-selective species usually reproduce a lot shorter period, minimal to low parental care, shorter lifespans, smaller body sizes, and have many offspring. Here I have examples of K-selective species being elephants, humans, and whales, or R-selective species being insects, bacteria, rodents, and fish. Now, a couple of things not on the slide. In K-selective species, we generally see a greater amount of intelligence versus R-selective species. Also, this is not an either-or. This is a sliding scale. So a species can be more K-selective or less K-selective, or more R-selective and less R-selective. And lastly, species that are K-selective seem to thrive and do better in stable, unchanging environments, where species that are R-selective seem to do better in unstable and changing environments. All right, the next lecture we're going to go ahead and start looking at primates.